The wind wailed through the crags of Charistos, a mournful dirge that carried the scent of ash and despair. Beneath a sky torn asunder by twilight's crimson claws, a village clung to the mountainside, its mud brick homes trembling under the weight of a merciless drought. Olive groves, once vibrant with silver-green life, stood withered, their branches clawing at the heavens in silent supplication. In this forsaken corner of the Greek world, where the gods turned their faces away, a girl named Eirene stood on the edge of an abyss, her heart a drumbeat of defiance against the coming storm. She was 14, her dark eyes blazing with a fire that belied her frail frame, her beauty a curse that drew shadows to her door. Barefoot, clad in a tattered tunic, she faced the raiders who descended like wolves at dusk men with bronze blades and hearts of stone, their laughter a blade sharper than any sword. They came for flesh, for the debts of a village broken by famine and war, and their eyes fixed on Eirene, a prize to be claimed. Her mother's screams echoed, her father's shame a silent wound, as chains replaced the freedom of her mountain home. In that moment, as the raiders tore her from her world, Irene's story began, a saga of fire and blood, of a girl who would defy gods and men to reclaim her soul. From the gilded cruelty of Athens' symposiums to the wild heart of Crete's mountains, her journey would burn through the tapestry of a civilization built on the bones of the powerless, a cry that would echo through the ages, unyielding and eternal. Chapter 1: The Fall of Eirene. The wind howled through the jagged mountain passes, carrying the scent of wild thyme and despair. Beneath a sky bruised purple by dusk, the village of Charistos clung to the slopes like a stubborn child gripping its mother's skirts. Mud brick homes huddled together, their thatched roofs trembling under the weight of an unyielding drought. The olive groves, once lush with silver-green leaves, now stood withered, their gnarled branches clawing at the heavens as if pleading for mercy. In this forgotten corner of the Greek world, where gods seemed to have turned their gaze elsewhere, a girl named Eirene stood on the precipice of her undoing. She was 14, though her eyes carried the weight of someone twice her age. Her dark hair fell in tangled waves, framing a face that bore the dangerous gift of beauty cheekbones, sharp as a sculptor's dream, eyes like twin pools of midnight that shimmered with defiance. Barefoot, clad in a tattered tunic spun from coarse wool, she stood outside her family's crumbling home, her small hands clenched into fists. The air was thick with the bleating of goats and the distant wail of a mother mourning a child lost to fever. Irene's heart thundered in her chest, not from the familiar sounds of village life, but from the shadow that had descended upon Charistos with the setting sun. They came at twilight, as predators often do. The cackle of their laughter preceded them, sharp and cruel, slicing through the evening's fragile peace. Hooves churned the dust along the narrow path leading to the village square, and the glint of bronze caught the fading light swords, chains and the cold menace of greed. Raiders, cloaked in the garb of slave merchants, rode into Charistos with the confidence of men who knew no resistance could stand against them. Their leader, a hulking figure with a scar splitting his brow, dismounted with a thud that shook the earth. His eyes, glinting like polished obsidian, swept over the villagers who had gathered, trembling in the square. "Debts must be paid," he bellowed, his voice a thunderclap that silenced even the goats. "Your fields are barren, your wells dry. The gods have forsaken you, but we offer salvation, silver for flesh. Who among you will settle the ledger?" Irene's father, Nikos, stood at the edge of the crowd, his weathered hands clutching a staff as if it could ward off fate. His once proud shoulders sagged, broken by years of toil and the recent death of his son, Theron, cut down in a skirmish against Spartan raiders. Beside him, Irene's mother, Leda, wept silently, her face buried in her shawl. The drought had stolen their harvest, the war had stolen their son, and now the merchants demanded the only currency they had left, their daughter. Irene felt the weight of her parents' gaze, though neither could meet her eyes. She wanted to scream, to run, to tear the earth apart with her bare hands, but her feet remained rooted to the ground, bound by a love that was both her strength and her shackle. The merchant's men moved through the crowd, their rough hands inspecting the village's youth like farmers appraising livestock. They lingered on Irene, their fingers tracing the curve of her jaw, the strength in her slender arms. "This one," the leader growled, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "She'll fetch a fine price in Athens, a jewel for the symposiums." Her mother's sob broke the silence, a sound so raw it seemed to tear the fabric of the night. Leda lunged forward, her hands clawing at the merchant's tunic. "Not my daughter?" she cried, her voice a desperate hymn to a god who did not listen. The merchant's fist met her cheek with a sickening crack, and Leda crumpled to the ground, blood trickling from her lip. Nikos moved to shield her, but a spear's point at his throat froze him in place. Irene's world tilted, the edges blurring as her mother's cries echoed in her ears. "No!" Irene's voice erupted, a defiance she hadn't known she possessed. She threw herself between the merchant and her mother, her small frame trembling with rage. "Take me, but leave her!" The crowd gasped, and for a moment, even the merchant paused, his cruel eyes narrowing as if reassessing his prize. Then he laughed, a sound like gravel grinding underfoot, and seized her wrist with a grip that burned like iron, fresh from the forge. "So spirited," he mused, his breath sour with wine. "They'll enjoy breaking you in the city." The village square dissolved into chaos. Children wailed, men shouted, and women clung to their families as the merchants dragged their chosen prey toward the waiting carts. Irene fought, her nails raking at the merchant's arm, drawing blood that glistened black in the torchlight. But her struggles were futile against the strength of men hardened by cruelty. They bound her wrists with coarse rope, the fibers biting into her skin, and threw her into a wooden cage on the back of a cart. Inside, other children huddled, boys and girls, their faces pale with terror, their eyes hollow with the knowledge of what awaited them. As the cart lurched forward, Irene pressed her face against the slats, her gaze fixed on her parents. Nico stood motionless, his staff fallen to the dirt, his face a mask of shame. Leda, still on her knees, reached out with trembling hands, her lips forming Irene's name in a silent prayer. The image burned itself into Irene's soul, a wound that would never heal. She clung to the memory of her mother's love, as the cart carried her away from the only world she had ever known. The journey to Athens was a descent into Hades. Chained together, the captives marched through landscapes that mocked their suffering with beauty, olive groves shimmering under starlight, coastal paths where the sea sang of freedom, mountain passes where eagles screamed overhead. But Irene saw none of it. Her world had shrunk to the clank of iron, the ache in her blistered feet, and the suffocating weight of despair. The other captives were silent, their spirits already fraying. A boy no older than 10 sobbed until his voice gave out, earning a lash from the overseer's whip. Irene bit her lip to keep from crying out, tasting blood as she forced herself to endure. At night, they were chained to stakes driven into the earth, their bodies pressed against the cold ground. Irene lay on her side, the iron collar around her neck a constant reminder of her new reality. She listened to the muffled sobs of her fellow captives, their voices weaving a tapestry of shared grief. In the darkness, a girl named Chloe, barely older than Irene, whispered tales of her own village, her words a fragile thread of resistance against the void. "They can chain our bodies," Chloe murmured, her voice fierce despite its softness. "But they cannot chain our stories." The slave market in Athens was a cacophony of despair. The air reeked of sweat, fear, and something fouler that Irene could not name. Voices clashed, haggling, pleading, commanding. As buyers circled like vultures, naked bodies stood on platforms, their humanity stripped away as casually as their clothes. Eirene was scrubbed and oiled, her skin made to gleam for the auction, her beauty a curse that marked her for a fate worse than fieldwork. The auctioneer's voice boomed, describing her as a rare flower from the mountains, untouched and spirited, perfect for the finest households. The words were a blade, carving away her identity with every syllable. The bidding was fierce, a storm of voices competing for ownership of her soul. Irene stood frozen, her eyes fixed on the ground, trying to vanish into herself as strange hands prodded her body. A man's fingers forced her mouth open to check her teeth. Another gripped her arm, testing its strength. She was no longer Irene, daughter of Nikos and Leda, but a commodity, her worth measured in silver and lust. The winning bidder was Callista, a widow whose wealth was matched only by her cruelty. Her eyes, cold as polished marble, raked over Irene with a hunger that made her blood run cold. "This one will do nicely," Callista purred, her voice a velvet sheath hiding a dagger's edge. Callista's household was a labyrinth of opulence and horror. Marble columns soared to painted ceilings. Mosaics of gods and heroes adorned the floors, and the air was thick with the scent of wine and perfume. But beneath the grandeur lay a darkness that clung to the walls like damp rot. Irene was led to the basement, a warren of stone cells where the female slaves slept. Her new home was a straw mattress, a thin blanket, and a chamber pot, the walls thick enough to muffle screams. Melina, the overseer, was a former slave whose survival had forged her into a weapon of cruelty. Her eyes, sharp as flint, missed nothing, and her whip was never far from hand. "You are nothing now," Melina said, her voice a low growl as she tossed Irene a tattered tunic. "Your name, your past, your gods, they mean nothing here. You exist to serve Callista and her guests. Obey and you may eat. Resist and you will beg for death." Irene's first night was a baptism of fire. She was bathed, her body oiled until it gleamed, and dressed in a translucent tunic that left nothing to the imagination. Gold bracelets adorned her wrists, not as adornments, but as shackles marking her purpose. The symposium was a glittering affair, the room filled with Athens' elite philosophers with silver tongues, politicians drunk on power, merchants whose wealth could buy cities. They reclined on couches, their laughter mingling with the clink of goblets and the strains of a lyre. Irene served wine, her hands trembling as she poured, her eyes fixed on the floor to avoid their gazes. But the night turned feral as the wine flowed. The philosophical debates gave way to crude jests, the air thickening with a predatory hunger. A man old enough to be her grandfather beckoned her to his couch. His smile was a mask, his words honeyed as he asked about her homeland, her family. His hand rested on her shoulder, then slid lower, his grip tightening when she flinched. "Such fire," he murmured, his breath hot against her ear. "Let's see how brightly it burns." Irene's heart pounded, a caged bird desperate for escape. She pushed against him, her small act of defiance met with laughter from the other guests. The man's smile twisted into a snarl and he seized her wrist, dragging her closer. The room spun, the faces blurring into a gallery of leering masks. She screamed, a sound swallowed by the revelry as hands tore at her tunic. In that moment, her childhood shattered, the pieces scattered across the marble floor like broken pottery. Afterward, she lay in her cell, staring at the stone ceiling, her body a map of bruises, her soul a battlefield of grief and rage. The stars she once watched from her family's roof were gone, replaced by the suffocating dark of her new reality. Yet in the silence a spark flickered, a memory of her mother's voice, her father's laugh, the wind through the olive groves. It was faint, fragile, but it was hers. And in that moment, Irene vowed to hold on to it, to fight for the girl she had been, even as the world sought to erase her. The days that followed were a crucible, forging her into something new. Melina's whip was a constant threat, her rules a litany of control. Speak only when spoken to, never meet a free person's eyes, obey every command no matter how vile. But Eirene watched, learned, and waited. She saw the other slaves, Chloe, with her fierce whispers, Thalia, whose scars told stories of defiance, and others, their spirits broken but not extinguished. They shared glances, small gestures of solidarity, a silent language born of shared suffering. One night, as Eirene served at another symposium, she overheard a guest philosopher named Ariston speak of virtue and justice, his words dripping with irony as his hands roamed her body. The contradiction burned in her chest, fueling a resolve that grew stronger with each indignity. She would survive, not as a ghost, but as a flame, waiting for the moment to burn through the chains that bound her. And so, in the shadows of Callista's house, beneath the weight of a civilization built on cruelty, Eirene began to weave her own story, one of resistance, of memory, of a girl who refused to be forgotten. Chapter 2. The Chains of Silence. The air in Callista's grand house hung heavy with the scent of myrrh and betrayal, a gilded cage where beauty masked barbarity. The marble halls echoed with the clink of goblets and the hollow laughter of men who wore virtue as a cloak by day and shed it like snakeskin by night. For Eirene, now 16, the world had narrowed to a labyrinth of stone and shadow, each step a negotiation with despair. Her cell in the basement, a crypt of damp straw in flickering torchlight, was both prison and sanctuary, a place where she could collapse, unseen, and gather the fragments of herself that the symposiums tore away. Her body bore the map of her servitude, scars like constellations across her back, bruises blooming like dark flowers on her arms, and the raw red ring around her ankle where the iron shackle bit into her flesh. Yet it was her eyes, those midnight pools that once sparkled with defiance, that had changed most profoundly. They had grown guarded, sharp, learning to read the subtle shifts in the air, the tightening of a guest's smile, the predatory glint in Melina's gaze, the unspoken hierarchies among the slaves. Eirene had become a creature of survival, her spirit tempered like bronze in a forge, brittle but unyielding. The days in Callista's household followed a cruel rhythm. Dawn brought barley porridge, thin and tasteless, served in chipped clay bowls. The slaves ate in silence, their spoons scraping against the pottery like the whispers of ghosts. Melina, the overseer, prowled among them, her whip coiled like a serpent at her side. "Eat quickly," she would snap, her voice a blade honed by years of breaking others to mirror her own fractured soul. "The mistress expects perfection tonight. Fail her, and you'll wish for the mines." Eirene had learned to move like a shadow, her presence barely a ripple in the opulent chaos of the house. She polished silver, scrubbed mosaics until her fingers bled, and poured wine with a grace that belied the tremor in her heart. But it was the symposiums, those glittering gatherings of Athens' elite, that were her true crucible. Each night, the dining hall transformed into a theater of cruelty, where philosophers debated the soul's immortality while stripping hers away, where politicians preached justice while their hands claimed her body as their due. Tonight, the air buzzed with anticipation. Callista had announced a grand symposium to honor a visiting general, Leonidas, whose victories against the Persians had made him a hero in the city's marble-clad heart. The slaves were bathed and oiled, their bodies adorned with gauzy tunics and golden trinkets that marked them as ornaments rather than humans. Eirene stood before a bronze mirror, her reflection a stranger's, her dark hair braided with cruel precision, her skin gleaming under a sheen of oil, her eyes hollow but alert. Chloe, the older slave who had become her anchor, whispered as she fastened a bracelet around Irene's wrist. "Keep your head down tonight. Leonidas is no philosopher. He craves blood as much as wine. The dining hall was a vision of decadence, its walls painted with scenes of gods and nymphs, its floor a mosaic of crashing waves and leaping dolphins. Couches draped in crimson silk lined the room, where men reclined, their tunics dyed in hues of wealth purple, saffron, and indigo. The air was thick with the scent of roasted lamb and honeyed figs, but beneath it lingered the acrid tang of fear, a perfume only the slaves could smell. Irene moved among the guests, her hand steady as she poured wine from a silver amphora, her eyes fixed on the floor to avoid their gazes. Leonidas dominated the room, his presence a storm cloud. Broad-shouldered and battle-scarred, he lounged like a lion, his laughter booming as he recounted tales of conquest. His eyes, however, were cold, scanning the slaves with the precision of a hunter. When they landed on Irene, she felt a chill, as if a blade had grazed her spine. "That one," he said, pointing a thick finger. "Bring her to me." The room quieted, the guests' conversations fading into a hungry silence. Irene's heart thundered, but she forced her feet to move, each step a descent into a familiar abyss. She knelt beside his couch, offering the amphora, but he waved it away. "No wine," he said, his voice low, dangerous. "Tell me, girl, do they breed such beauty in the mountains, or are you a gift from Aphrodite herself?" The other guests laughed, their mirth a chorus of wolves. Irene's tongue felt leaden, but she knew silence was not an option. "I am from Charistos, my lord," she said, her voice steady despite the storm within. "No goddess, just a girl." His hand shot out, seizing her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. His eyes were not lustful but cruel, seeking not pleasure but dominance. "A girl with fire," he mused. "Let's see how long it burns." He released her, but the command lingered in the air, a promise of worse to come. As the night wore on, the symposium devolved into its inevitable chaos. The philosophical debates on virtue, on the gods, on the nature of power, gave way to bawdy songs and drunken boasts. The slaves became the entertainment, their bodies bartered for amusement. Irene was summoned to Leonidas's couch again, this time to feed him grapes, her fingers trembling as she placed them in his mouth. His hand wandered, rough and possessive, and when she flinched, he laughed, a sound that echoed like a war drum. Then came the game, a cruel invention born of wine and boredom. Leonidas stood, his shadow swallowing the room, and declared a contest. "Let us see which slave can please us most," he roared to the delight of the guests. "A prize for the one who bends without breaking." The slaves were lined up, their faces pale, their eyes darting like trapped animals. Irene stood among them, her heart a war between fear and fury. She glanced at Chloe, whose lips moved in a silent prayer, and Thalia, whose scarred hands clenched into fists. The task began innocently enough: pour wine, sing a song, dance in the flickering torchlight. But the demands grew darker, the guests' laughter sharper. Irene was chosen to dance, her body moving to the lyre's mournful tune, her tunic clinging to her like a second skin. The guests watched, their eyes glinting with hunger, their hands reaching as she passed. One man, a merchant named Cleon, grabbed her wrist, pulling her onto his couch. "Dance closer," he slurred, his breath sour with wine. She twisted free, but not before his fingers left bruises on her arm. The room erupted in cheers, mistaking her struggle for part of the performance. Leonidas, however, was not amused. "Defiant, are we?" he growled, rising from his couch. He seized a bronze goblet and hurled it at her, the metal grazing her temple. Blood trickled down her cheek, warm and sticky, but she stood her ground, her eyes blazing with a fire she could no longer contain. "Enough!" Callista's voice cut through the din, sharp as a whip. She stood at the head of the room, her silk gown shimmering like moonlight on water. This one needs a lesson in obedience. She nodded to Melina, who stepped forward, her whip uncoiling like a serpent waking from slumber. Irene's heart sank, but she refused to cower. The first lash struck her back, a line of fire that stole her breath. The second brought her to her knees. The third drew a cry she could not suppress, a sound that mingled with the guests' laughter. As Melina raised her whip again, Chloe lunged forward, placing herself between Irene and the blow. "She's just a girl!" Chloe shouted, her voice trembling but resolute. The room fell silent, the guests stunned by the audacity of a slave. Melina's face twisted with rage, and she struck Chloe instead, the whip leaving a crimson welt across her cheek. "You'll both pay for this," Melina hissed, dragging them both toward the basement. In the darkness of their cell, Irene and Chloe clung to each other, their breasts ragged, their bodies trembling. Blood seeped from Irene's wounds, staining the straw beneath her, but Chloe's presence was a balm. "You shouldn't have done that," Irene whispered, her voice thick with guilt. Chloe's smile was faint but fierce. "We're not their toys," she said. "Not yet." That night, as the house slept, Irene found a scrap of papyrus among the refuse, a fragment of a philosopher's musings on freedom. She hid it beneath her mattress, a secret act of defiance. She began to collect these scraps, piecing together words she could barely read, teaching herself in stolen moments. It was a rebellion of the mind, a way to reclaim the girl who once dreamed under the stars of Charistos. But rebellion carried a price. Melina's eyes were everywhere, her cruelty a constant shadow. One evening she caught Irene whispering to Chloe about the papyrus, their heads bent together in the dim light of the kitchen. "Learning, are we?" Melina sneered, snatching the scrap and tearing it to pieces. "You think words will save you?" She struck Irene across the face, the blow sending her sprawling. Then, as punishment, she locked Irene in a storage closet, a suffocating tomb of darkness where the air was thick with dust and despair. For 3 days, Irene languished there, without food or water, her body weakening but her spirit unbowed. In the silence, she traced the contours of her mother's face in her mind, clinging to the memory of love to keep madness at bay. On the third night, she heard a faint scratching at the door. It was Thalia, risking everything to slip a crust of bread through the crack. "Live," Thalia whispered, her voice a lifeline. "Live and make them pay." When Irene was released, her body was frail, but her resolve had hardened into something unbreakable. She returned to the symposiums, her movements mechanical, her eyes distant. But beneath the surface, a plan was forming. She watched Melina's routines, noting the keys that hung at her waist, the patterns of the guards, the moments when the house was quiet. She shared her observations with Chloe and Thalia, their whispers a conspiracy born in the shadows. One night, as a storm raged outside, Irene saw her chance. Melina, distracted by a drunken guest, left her keys unattended on a table. Irene's heart pounded as she slipped them into her tunic, her fingers trembling with the weight of possibility. But before she could signal Chloe, a hand closed around her wrist. It was Cleon, the merchant, his eyes gleaming with suspicion. "Planning something, little one?" he murmured, his grip tightening. Irene's breath caught, her mind racing. She smiled, a mask of submission, and offered him wine, her voice soft and deferential. He relaxed, but the moment had passed. The keys burned against her skin, a promise of freedom and a threat of ruin. She returned them before Melina noticed, but the seed of rebellion had taken root. She would wait, she would watch, and she would strike when the time was right. In the darkness of her cell, Irene lay awake, the storm's thunder echoing her heartbeat. She thought of the stars above Charistos, the wind through the olive groves, the girl she had been. That girl was not dead, only buried, and Irene would dig until she found her again. The chains of silence bound her, but they would not hold her forever. In the shadows of Callista's house, a fire was kindling, and it would burn until the world knew her name. Chapter 3. The Ember of Defiance. The house of Callista stood like a temple to cruelty, its marble facade gleaming under the Athenian sun, while its heart pulsed with shadows. For Eirene, now 17, the days had blurred into a relentless cycle of servitude, each one a hammer blow, forging her spirit into something sharper, harder, yet perilously close to breaking. The symposiums, with their drunken revelry and veiled brutality, had become as familiar as the ache in her bones. But within her, a spark flickered, a defiant ember that refused to be snuffed out, fueled by stolen moments of resistance and the fragile bonds she had woven with her fellow slaves. The basement cells were an underworld of whispers and despair, where torchlight cast long, wavering shadows on the damp stone walls. Irene's straw mattress, worn thin by countless nights, offered little comfort, but it was here, in the quiet hours before dawn, that she and Chloe planned their rebellion. Thalia, too, had joined their clandestine pact, her scarred hands steady as she shared tales of escapes that had failed and others that had come achingly close to success. Their conversations were a tapestry of hope and fear, woven in hushed tones to evade Melina's ever-watchful eyes. Tonight the house buzzed with a different energy. Callista was hosting a symposium to celebrate a new alliance with a powerful merchant family from Corinth, a union sealed not in friendship but in silver and ambition. The slaves were summoned early, their bodies scrubbed and oiled, their tunics so sheer they seemed to mock modesty. Eirene stood before the bronze mirror, her reflection a ghost of the girl from Charistos. Her dark hair was bound in intricate braids, adorned with gold pins that gleamed like false promises. Her eyes, though, burned with a quiet ferocity, a silent vow that tonight would be different. Chloe, standing beside her, pressed a small, sharp fragment of pottery into her palm, a shard broken from a discarded amphora, its edge honed to a dangerous point. "Hide it well," Chloe whispered, her voice barely audible over the clatter of the kitchen. "If the moment comes, you'll know what to do." Eirene tucked the shard into the folds of her tunic, its weight both a burden and a beacon. It was no key to freedom, but it was a choice, a sliver of agency in a world that had stripped her of all else. The dining hall was a riot of opulence, its air thick with the scent of roasted peacock and spiced wine. Couches draped in Tyrian purple cradled the guest merchants with gold-ringed fingers, politicians whose speeches echoed in the agora, and a philosopher named Sophron, whose treatises on virtue were as revered as his private cruelties were whispered. Callista presided over the gathering like a goddess, her silk gown shimmering, her smile a blade cloaked in charm. Leonidas, the general from the previous symposium, was absent, but his absence was no comfort. The new guests brought their own hungers, their eyes roving over the slaves like wolves circling a flock. Eirene moved among them, her steps measured, her hands steady as she poured wine. She had learned to anticipate their moods, the way a merchant's laugh turns sharp with desire, the way a politician's touch lingered too long. But tonight, her senses were heightened, every sound and shadow a potential threat or opportunity. She caught Chloe's eye across the room, a silent signal passing between them. Thalia, serving a tray of figs, stood ready, her posture tense but composed. The evening began with the usual pretense of civility. Sophron held forth on the nature of the soul, his voice smooth as polished marble, while the guests nodded sagely, their goblets never empty. But as the wine flowed, the mask of decorum slipped. The philosopher's words grew slurred, his arguments devolving into crude jests. A merchant named Theron, whose wealth came from trading slaves across the Aegean, called for entertainment. "Let the girls dance," he bellowed, his voice thick with anticipation. The other guests roared their approval, their eyes glinting in the torchlight. Irene's heart thudded, but she stepped forward with the other slaves, her body moving to the mournful wail of a flute. The dance was a ritual of submission, each step designed to entice, each gesture a surrender to the guest's desires. But as she spun, the pottery shard pressed against her thigh, a reminder of her hidden defiance. She caught Sophron's gaze, his eyes narrowing as if sensing her resistance. "That one," he said, pointing at her. "She has spirit. Let's see it broken." The room stilled, the air heavy with expectation. Callista's smile was a crescent moon, cold and distant. "Bring her to the center," she commanded. Melina appeared, her whip coiled but ready, her eyes gleaming with the promise of punishment. Irene's breath caught, but she held her ground, the shard a secret fire in her grasp. As Melina seized her arm, Irene's fingers tightened around the weapon, her mind racing. This was the moment Chloe had spoken of, the precipice between surrender and rebellion. Before Melina could drag her forward, a cry shattered the silence. Thalia, standing near Theron, had spilled a tray of wine, the crimson liquid splashing across his pristine tunic. The merchant roared, his hand striking Thalia's face with a force that sent her sprawling. The guests laughed, their mirth a jagged blade. But Irene saw the flicker of intent in Thalia's eyes. It was no accident, a distraction, a spark to ignite their plan. Chloe moved swiftly, slipping behind a couch to retrieve a hidden bundle of cloth, soaked in oil, stolen from the kitchen. Irene's heart surged with hope and dread. Their plan was desperate, a fire to sow chaos, a chance to slip through the guard's grasp while the house panicked. But the risks were monstrous. If they failed, the punishment would be unthinkable. Irene seized the moment, wrenching free from Melina's grip. She darted toward the nearest torch, her fingers fumbling for the shard. But Sophron was faster, his hand closing around her wrist with a strength that belied his scholarly demeanor. "Not so fast," he hissed, his breath hot against her ear. "You think you can defy us?" He twisted her arm, forcing her to her knees, the shard slipping from her grasp and clattering to the floor. The room erupted in chaos. Thalia, recovering from the blow, lunged at Theron, her nails raking his face. Chloe hurled what's next. System, the oil-soaked cloth toward a brazier, the flames catching with a roar that sent shadows dancing wildly across the walls. The guests shouted, some in anger, others in drunken amusement, mistaking the blaze for part of the evening's entertainment. Callista's voice rose above the din, sharp and commanding. "Seize them!" Melina, her face a mask of fury, charged toward Chloe, whip raised like a viper poised to strike. Irene's world slowed, each heartbeat a thunderclap. The pottery shard lay just out of reach, glinting in the firelight like a fallen star. She lunged for it, her fingers closing around its jagged edge as Melina's whip cracked, missing her by inches. She scrambled to her feet, the shard her only weapon, her only claim to agency in a world that sought to crush her. "Chloe, run!" she screamed, her voice raw with desperation. Chloe dodged Melina's grasp, weaving through the chaos as the fire spread, licking at the tapestries that adorned the walls. The guests, now realizing the danger, stumbled over their couches, their fine tunics catching on the flames. Theron, blood streaming from the scratches on his face, bellowed for the guards. Irene's eyes met Thalia's, a silent agreement passing between them. They would fight even if it meant their end. Thalia grabbed a bronze goblet and hurled it at a guard rushing into the room, the metal striking his temple with a dull thud. The man staggered, giving Irene a moment to act. She drove the shard into Melina's arm, the overseer's scream echoing as blood welled from the wound. But Melina was no ordinary foe. Her pain only fueled her rage. She seized Irene's hair, yanking her backward with a force that sent her crashing to the floor. The shard skittered away, lost in the chaos. "Foolish girl!" Melina snarled, her whip descending like a bolt of lightning. The lash struck Irene's shoulder, tearing through her tunic and skin. Pain exploded, white-hot and blinding, but Irene clung to her defiance, her eyes locked on Chloe, who had reached the corridor leading to the courtyard. "Go!" Irene gasped, her voice barely audible over the crackling flames and the guests' panicked shouts. Chloe hesitated, her face torn with anguish, but Thalia pushed her forward. "We'll hold them!" Thalia cried, grabbing a burning tapestry and flinging it toward the advancing guards. The fabric erupted into a wall of flame, buying precious seconds. Irene struggled to her feet, her vision swimming, her body screaming in protest. She had no weapon now, only her will, but it was enough to keep her moving. The courtyard was a maze of shadows, lit only by the flickering glow of distant torches. Chloe vanished into the darkness, her footsteps swallowed by the chaos. Irene and Thalia stumbled after her, their lungs burning with smoke, their bodies battered but unbowed. The guards were close behind, their shouts a storm at their heels. Irene's heart pounded with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. She was running, fighting, defying the gods and men who had chained her. They reached the outer wall, a towering barrier of stone that separated Callista's estate from the city beyond. Chloe was already there, clawing at a loose stone where they had hidden a crude rope woven from stolen linens. "Hurry!" She whispered, her hands trembling as she pulled the rope free. Thalia boosted Irene upward, her scarred hands steady despite the chaos. Irene gripped the rope, her muscles straining as she climbed, the rough fibers tearing at her palms. But fate was a cruel master. A guard's spear sailed through the air, its bronze tip glinting as it struck Thalia's leg. She fell with a cry, blood pooling beneath her. "Go!" Thalia gasped, her voice fierce despite the pain. "Don't let this be for nothing!" Irene's throat tightened, tears burning her eyes, but she climbed, her body moving on instinct. Chloe reached the top, pulling Irene over the wall as the guards closed in. They landed in the alley beyond, the city's pulse a distant hum beneath the roar of their own heartbeats. The fire had spread, its glow illuminating the night sky, drawing attention to Callista's estate. Irene and Chloe ran, their bare feet slapping against the cobblestones, their breaths ragged. The city was a labyrinth, its narrow streets a tangle of hope and danger. They ducked into a shadowed alcove, hiding behind a stack of amphorae as the guards' shouts echoed closer. "We can't stay here," Chloe whispered, her eyes wide with fear but resolute. "The docks, there's a ship leaving at dawn. We could stow away." Irene nodded, her mind racing. The docks were a gamble, crawling with merchants and slavers, but they were also a gateway to the sea, to a world beyond Athens' grasp. She thought of Thalia, left behind, her sacrifice a weight she would carry forever. They moved through the city like ghosts, avoiding the torch-lit streets where drunken revelers staggered home from their own symposiums. The air was thick with the scent of salt and fish, the docks drawing closer with each step. But as they rounded a corner, a figure loomed before them. Melina, her arm bandaged, her face a mask of vengeance. She held a dagger, its blade catching the moonlight like a promise of death. "You thought you could escape?" Melina hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You're nothing but chattel, and I'll drag you back in chains." Irene stepped in front of Chloe, her body trembling, but her resolve unbroken. She had no weapon, no plan, only the ember of defiance that burned within her. "You'll have to kill me first," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. Melina lunged, the dagger flashing toward Irene's heart. But Chloe was faster, shoving Irene aside and tackling Melina to the ground. The two grappled, a tangle of limbs and fury, as Irene scrambled for a weapon. Her fingers closed around a broken amphora shard lying in the alley, its edge sharp enough to draw blood. She hesitated, the weight of violence heavy in her hand. To strike was to become like them, to let their cruelty taint her soul, but to do nothing was to die. With a cry, Eirene drove the shard into Melina's shoulder, the overseer's scream piercing the night. Melina collapsed, clutching the wound, her dagger clattering to the ground. Chloe grabbed Irene's hand, pulling her away. "We have to go," she urged, her voice shaking. They ran, the docks looming ahead, the promise of freedom a fragile thread in the chaos. The harbor was a chaos of its own ships, creaking against their moorings, sailors shouting, and the ever-present threat of slavers patrolling the shadows. Irene and Chloe slipped aboard a merchant vessel, hiding in the hold among crates of olives and wine. The air was stifling, the darkness absolute, but they clung to each other, their breaths a shared prayer for salvation. As the ship began to move, the creak of wood and the slap of waves against the hull were a lullaby of hope. But hope was a fleeting thing. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, a shout rang out above deck. "Stowaways!" a sailor bellowed, his voice carrying through the hold. Irene's heart sank, her hand tightening around Chloe's. They had come so far, defied so much, only to be caught on the cusp of freedom. The hatch opened, and rough hands dragged them into the light, their bodies bruised and weary, but their spirits unbowed. The captain, a grizzled man with eyes like storm clouds, studied them. "You've caused quite a stir," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Callista's men are scouring the city for you. What's your story?" Irene met his gaze, her voice steady despite the fear. "We're not property," she said. "We're people, and we'd rather die than go back." The captain's eyes softened, a flicker of something pity perhaps, or recognition crossing his face. He glanced at his crew, then back at the girls. "The sea is no place for runaways," he said, "but it's a better fate than Callista's house. Stay hidden, and I'll get you to Crete. After that, you're on your own." Irene and Chloe exchanged a glance, their hands clasped tightly. Crete was no paradise, but it was a chance, a new chapter in a story they refused to let end. As the ship sailed into the horizon, Irene thought of Thalia, of the fire they had set, of the girl from Charistos who still lived within her. The Ember of Defiance burned brighter now, a beacon against the darkness. She was not free, not yet, but she was alive, and that was a victory no one could take from her. In the hold, surrounded by the creak of wood and the whisper of waves, Irene whispered a vow to the gods who had abandoned her. She would survive, she would remember, and she would carry Thalia's sacrifice, Chloe's courage, and her own unbroken spirit into whatever lay ahead. The sea stretched before them, vast and unyielding. But Irene was no longer just a girl from the mountains. She was a storm, gathering strength, ready to break upon the world. Chapter 4. The Sea of Shadows. The sea was a restless beast, its waves clawing at the hull of the merchant ship like the fingers of forgotten gods. In the dim hold, where the air was thick with the tang of salt and olives, Irene and Chloe crouched among crates, their bodies pressed close, their breaths shallow as if to make themselves smaller than the shadows. The creak of wood and the distant shouts of sailors were their only companions, a fragile barrier between them and the world that sought to reclaim them. Irene, now 17, felt the weight of their escape like a chain that had not yet been broken. Freedom was a word too heavy to speak, a dream too fragile to hold. The ship, bound for Crete, swayed beneath a sky bruised with storm clouds. The captain's mercy had granted them passage, but his warning echoed in Irene's mind. Stay hidden and pray to whatever gods you still believe in. She had no gods left, only the ember of defiance that burned in her chest, fed by the memory of Thalia's sacrifice and Chloe's unyielding courage. Her hand rested on the rough crate beside her, fingers tracing the grain of the wood as if it could anchor her to a world that no longer existed. Charistos, her village, was a fading star, its light dimmed by the horrors of Callista's house. Yet here, in the belly of the ship, Eirene felt a spark of something new, not hope, but possibility. Chloe's eyes, wide and alert, scanned the darkness. Her once fierce spirit was tempered now, her face etched with the strain of their flight. "Do you think they're still searching?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the ship's groans. Irene's gaze flicked to the hatch above, where slivers of torchlight pierced the gloom. "Callista won't stop," she replied, her voice low but firm. "Not until she's certain we're dead or back in chains." The memory of their escape burned bright in Irene's mind, the fire roaring through Callista's dining hall. Thalia's blood on the cobblestones, Melina's scream as the pottery shard pierced her flesh. They had struck a blow against their captors, but the cost was heavy. Thalia's fate was unknown, her sacrifice a wound that bled with every breath. Irene's fingers tightened around Chloe's hand, a silent vow to make their freedom worth the price. The hold was a labyrinth of crates and barrels, the air heavy with the scent of brine and decay. The girls had carved out a small space behind a stack of amphorae, their bodies wedged between the rough wood and the ship's curving hull. Hunger gnawed at their bellies. They had eaten only a crust of bread, stolen from the sailors' stores. But it was the uncertainty that gnawed deeper. Crete was a distant shore, a land of myths and monsters, and the captain's promise was a thin thread in a tapestry of danger. The first sign of trouble came with the creak of the hatch. Irene's heart lurched as torchlight flooded the hold, casting jagged shadows across the crates. Heavy footsteps echoed, slow and deliberate, accompanied by the low murmur of voices. "Check every corner," a man growled, his tone sharp with authority. "The mistress paid good silver for those girls. They're here somewhere." Chloe's hand tightened on Irene's, her breath hitching. Eirene pressed a finger to her lips, her eyes scanning for an escape. The hold offered no exits, only the maze of cargo and the unyielding walls of the ship. She reached into her tunic, her fingers brushing the small, sharp stone she had salvaged from the alley in Athens, a poor weapon, but all she had. The footsteps drew closer, the torchlight licking at their hiding place like a predator's tongue. "Over here," another voice called, and the crates shifted as hands tore at them. Irene's pulse thundered, her mind racing. They could fight, but against armed men, it would be a slaughter. They could surrender, but that meant returning to Callista's house, to a fate worse than death. Her eyes met Chloe's, and in that silent exchange, they made their choice. They would not go back. Eirene gestured toward a narrow gap between two barrels, barely wide enough for their bodies. They crawled, their tunics snagging on splinters, their knees scraping against the rough wood. The men's voices grew louder, their torches casting flickering ghosts on the walls. "They can't have gone far," one said, his tone laced with frustration. "The captain's hiding them, I wager. He'll pay for this." The mention of the captain sent a chill through Eirene. His kindness had been their salvation, but if he was suspected, their fragile sanctuary would crumble. She and Chloe squeezed into the gap, their bodies pressed against the cold hull, the stone in Irene's hand a desperate talisman. The men's footsteps paused, their torches so close that Eirene could feel the heat. She held her breath, her heart a war drum in her chest. Then, a miraculous shout from above deck. "Storm's coming!" a sailor bellowed, his voice cutting through the hold. "All hands now!" The searchers cursed, their footsteps retreating as the hatch slammed shut, plunging the hold back into darkness. Eirene exhaled, her body trembling with relief, but the storm's approach was no comfort. The sea was a merciless judge, and they were at its mercy. The ship lurched as the storm hit, its timbers groaning under the assault of waves. Eirene and Chloe clung to the crates, their bodies battered by the ship's violent sway. Water seeped through the hull, cold and relentless, pooling around their feet. The whole became a chaos of shifting cargo, amphorae crashing against barrels, their contents spilling in a flood of wine and oil. Irene's stone slipped from her grasp, lost in the dark water, and with it went a piece of her courage. "We'll drown if we stay here," Chloe whispered, her voice shaking but resolute. Irene nodded, her mind racing. The hold was a death trap, but the deck was no safer. Exposure meant discovery, and discovery meant chains. Yet the storm was their ally, its chaos a cloak to hide their movements. They crawled from their hiding place, their hands slick with oil, their tunics soaked and heavy. The hatch was their only way out, a gamble that could lead to freedom or ruin. They climbed, their fingers slipping on the wet ladder, the ships rocking, threatening to hurl them back into the hold. The hatch opened to a world of fury. Rain lashed the deck, waves crashed over the rails, and the sky was a roiling mass of black and silver. Sailors scrambled, their shouts lost in the wind's howl. Irene and Chloe crouched behind a coil of rope, their bodies shivering in the icy deluge. The storm was their shield, but it was also their enemy, each wave a reminder of the sea's indifference. A flash of lightning illuminated the deck, revealing a figure at the helm, the captain, his face grim as he wrestled with the ship's wheel. Irene's heart ached with gratitude and guilt. He had risked everything for them, strangers in a world that valued them only as property. She wanted to call out, to thank him, but the storm's roar swallowed all sound. Chloe tugged at her arm, pointing toward a small boat lashed to the deck, a fragile hope, but hope nonetheless. They moved, their steps unsteady on the slick wood, their hands clutching each other for balance. The boat was their salvation, a chance to escape if they could launch it without being seen. But as they reached it, a hand seized Irene's shoulder, spinning her around. It was one of the searchers, his face twisted with triumph. "Found you!" he roared, his voice barely audible over the storm. His dagger gleamed, raised to strike. Irene reacted on instinct, driving her elbow into his stomach. He doubled over, gasping, and Chloe shoved him, sending him sprawling across the deck. The storm's chaos was their ally now, the wind and rain masking their struggle. They worked frantically, untying the boat's ropes, their hands numb with cold. The ship lurched, a wave crashing over them, and Irene's vision blurred as water filled her lungs. She coughed, clinging to the boat, her determination a fire that no storm could extinguish. With a final heave, they freed the boat, dragging it toward the rail. The searcher recovered, his dagger flashing as he lunged again. Irene ducked, the blade grazing her arm, blood mixing with the rain. Chloe grabbed a loose oar, swinging it with all her strength. It struck the man's head and he collapsed, his body sliding across the deck as the ship tilted. They had no time to mourn or regret. They pushed the boat over the rail, its weight pulling them with it into the churning sea. The water was a shock of cold, stealing Irene's breath as it closed over her head. She kicked, her arms flailing, until her hands found the boat's edge. Chloe was there, her face pale but fierce, pulling herself aboard. They clung to the small vessel, its wooden frame a fragile shield against the storm's wrath. Waves battered them, the boat rising and falling like a leaf in a torrent. Irene's body screamed with exhaustion, but she rowed, her arms burning, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon where Crete might lie. Hours passed, or perhaps days. The storm blurred time into a haze of survival. The rain eased, the waves calmed, and the sky lightened to a bruised gray. Irene and Chloe lay in the boat, their bodies soaked and trembling, their breaths ragged but alive. The sea stretched endless around them, a vast, uncharted wilderness that offered no promises. They had no food, no water, only each other and the stubborn will to endure. "We made it," Chloe whispered, her voice hoarse but triumphant. Irene nodded, her throat too tight for words. They had escaped Callista's house, defied the storm, and outwitted their pursuers. But freedom was not a shore they had reached. It was a battle they would fight every day. She thought of Thalia, of the captain, of the girl from Charistos who still lived in her heart. Each was a thread in the tapestry of her survival, a story she would carry forward. As the sun broke through the clouds, casting golden light across the sea, Eirene felt the ember of defiance flare brighter. Crete was out there, a land of unknown dangers and possibilities. She and Chloe were not free, not yet, but they were alive, and that was a victory forged in fire and blood. They rowed, their strokes weak but steady, toward a horizon that promised nothing but the chance to write their own ending. And in that moment, Eirene knew she was no longer just a slave. She was a storm, a force that would not be tamed, carrying the weight of her past and the fire of her future into the sea of shadows. Chapter 5. The Shores of Fate. The sea stretched before Eirene and Chloe like a tapestry woven of liquid obsidian, its surface shimmering under a sky that bled gold and crimson with the dawn. Their small boat, a frail relic of their desperate escape, rocked gently on the waves, its timbers groaning as if weary of their burden. Eirene, now 17, gripped the oars, her hands blistered and raw, her body a map of aches and bruises from the storm's wrath. Beside her, Chloe huddled, her face pale as bone, her eyes scanning the horizon for the promise of Crete, a land that loomed in their imaginations as both sanctuary and enigma. The salt air stung their wounds, but it also carried a whisper of freedom, fragile and fleeting, like a song half remembered. They had survived the storm, outwitted Callista's hunters, and defied the sea itself, but survival was not triumph. Hunger clawed at their bellies, their throats parched from days without fresh water. The boat's hold held nothing but the remnants of their struggle, a torn tunic, a splintered oar, and the weight of their shared defiance. Irene's mind flickered to Thalia, left bleeding on the cobblestones of Athens, and to the captain who had risked his life to give them this chance. Each sacrifice was a stone in the foundation of their resolve, a debt they could only repay by living. "Look!" Chloe's voice, hoarse but sharp, cut through the silence. She pointed to a faint smudge on the horizon, a jagged line of green and gray against the endless blue. Crete. Irene's heart surged, a mixture of hope and dread. The island was no Eden. It was a land of merchants, mercenaries, and myths, where freedom could be as elusive as in Athens. But it was a new chapter, a chance to rewrite their story. She rowed harder, her muscles screaming, her eyes fixed on the distant shore. The sun climbed higher, its heat a merciless weight on their shoulders. The boat drifted closer, the smudge resolving into cliffs crowned with olive trees, their leaves glinting like silver in the morning light. But as they neared, a new sound pierced the air, the rhythmic creak of oars, the low hum of voices. Another ship, its sails taut against the wind, bore down on them from the east. Irene's stomach twisted. "Slavers?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the slap of waves. Chloe's eyes narrowed, her hand tightening on the oar. Or worse. They had heard tales of pirates who roamed these waters, men who saw runaways not as prey to be returned, but as prizes to be claimed. Eirene scanned the boat for a weapon, finding only the splintered oar, its end jagged but useless against armed men. Their escape had been a defiance of gods and men, but the sea cared nothing for their courage. The ship drew closer, its hull painted with the fierce eyes of a sea monster, its deck bristling with men whose bronze blades caught the sunlight. A figure stood at the prow, tall and lean, his cloak billowing like a raven's wings. "Ho there," he called, his voice carrying across the water, sharp with authority but laced with curiosity. "What brings two girls to the open sea in a boat fit for kindling?" Irene's heart pounded, but she forced her voice to steady. "We seek passage to Crete," she said, her words measured, her eyes never leaving his. "We mean no trouble." The lie was thin, but it was all she had. Beside her, Chloe gripped the oar, her body tense, ready to fight or flee. The man laughed, a sound like breaking waves, and signaled his crew to lower a rope ladder. No trouble, you say? Yet you've the look of trouble itself. Come aboard, or we'll drag you. His tone was light, but the threat was clear. Eirene and Chloe exchanged a glance, their silent pact unbroken. They had no choice. The sea would not hide them, and their boat would not outrun a ship. They climbed, their limbs trembling with exhaustion, the rope ladder swaying beneath them. The deck was a chaos of coiled ropes and weathered sailors, their eyes raking over the girls with a mix of suspicion and interest. The man at the prow introduced himself as Krios, captain of the Erythra, a merchant vessel that traded in wine, oil, and Eirene feared human cargo. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp as obsidian, but there was a flicker of something else in his gaze. Curiosity, perhaps, or recognition. "You're runaways," Creo said. Not a question, but a statement. He circled them, his cloak brushing the deck like a shadow. "From Athens, I'd wager. The city's buzzing with tales of a fire in a noblewoman's house. 2 slaves vanished into the night. Tell me, what makes you worth the trouble you've caused?" Irene's throat tightened, but she held his gaze. "We're worth nothing to those who owned us," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "But we're worth everything to ourselves." Chloe nodded, her hand still gripping the oar, a silent promise of resistance. Creo studied them, his expression unreadable. "Bold words for girls who look half dead," he said. "But boldness won't fill your bellies or keep you from the slaver's chains." He turned to his crew, barking orders to bring bread and water. Eirene hesitated, wary of kindness that could be a trap, but hunger overpowered caution. They ate, the coarse bread a lifeline, the water a balm to their parched throats. As they ate, Krios spoke, his voice low, meant for their ears alone. "I've no love for Athens' nobles," he said. "Their silver buys my wine, but their cruelty curdles it. I'll take you to Crete, but you'll work for your passage scrub decks, men's sails, whatever I ask. Betray me, and I'll sell you myself. Understand?" Eirene nodded, her mind racing. Krios was no savior, but he was a chance, a crack in the wall of their fate. She and Chloe worked, their hands blistered from ropes, their bodies aching from the ship's endless sway. The crew watched them, some with pity, others with hunger, but Krios' presence kept them at bay. He was a man of contradictions, sharp-tongued yet fair, a merchant who spoke of freedom as if he had once tasted it himself. The journey to Crete was a trial of endurance. Storms battered the Erythra, waves crashing over the deck, the wind howling like a chorus of furies. Eirene and Chloe worked through the chaos, their bodies pushed to the brink, their spirits buoyed by the knowledge that each wave brought them closer to a new beginning. At night, they huddled in a corner of the hold, whispering plans for what they would do in Crete find work, blend into the crowds, become ghosts in a land that did not know their names. But the past was a relentless hunter. On the 3rd day, as the cliffs of Crete loomed closer, a sail appeared on the horizon, a sleek vessel bearing the sigil of Athens, its oars cutting the water with predatory precision. Irene's heart sank. "Callista," she whispered, her voice trembling with dread. The noblewoman's reach was long, her vengeance a fire that burned across seas. Krios saw it too, his face darkening. "They're not here for trade," he muttered, his hand resting on the hilt of his dagger. He turned to Eirene and Chloe, his eyes hard but not unkind. "Hide in the hold and don't make a sound. If they board us, your cargo nothing more." They scrambled below, their bodies pressed against the damp wood, the hold's darkness a familiar refuge. The Athenian ship drew alongside, its captain shouting demands across the water. "We seek 2 runaway slaves," he called, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Girls, one with dark hair, the other slight and scarred. Surrender them, and you'll be rewarded." Irene's breath caught, her hand finding Chloe's in the dark. Krios's voice rang out, steady and defiant. "I carry wine and oil, not slaves. Search if you must, but you'll find nothing." The words were a gamble, a defiance that could cost him everything. Irene's heart ached with gratitude, but fear gnawed at its edges. If the Athenians searched the ship, their fragile freedom would end. The hold was silent save for the creak of the ship and the thud of boots above. Irene and Chloe burrowed deeper, their bodies wedged between barrels, their breaths held as if sound alone could betray them. The hatch opened, torchlights spilling into the hold, and heavy footsteps descended. A man's voice, sharp and impatient, barked orders. "Check every crate. They're here, I can smell their fear." Irene's fingers tightened around Chloe's, her mind racing. They had no weapons, no way to fight, only the hope that Krios's defiance would hold. The searchers tore through the hold, barrels rolling, amphorae shattering in their haste. A crate shifted, its edge grazing Irene's shoulder, and she bit her lip to stifle a gasp. The torchlight came closer, its heat a threat as tangible as a blade. Then a shout from above. "Fire!" a sailor cried, his voice laced with panic. The searchers froze, their torches wavering. Irene's heart leapt another fire, another distraction, though she knew not how or why. The men retreated, their footsteps pounding up the ladder, the hatch slamming shut. She and Chloe remained still, their bodies trembling, until the sounds of chaos above faded into the rhythm of the sea. When they emerged, the Athenian ship was a speck on the horizon, driven off by the threat of fire. Whether real or a ruse, Irene could not say. Krios stood at the helm, his face grim but triumphant. "You owe me," he said, his eyes meeting Irene's. "Crete's shore is yours, but the world beyond is no kinder than Athens. Remember that." The Erythra docked at a bustling harbor, its quays alive with merchants, fishermen, and the clamor of 1,000 tongues. Crete was a land of contrasts, sunlit hills and shadowed alleys, temples to gods and markets for men. Irene and Chloe stepped onto the shore, their feet unsteady on solid ground, their hearts heavy with the weight of their journey. They had no silver, no names, only each other and the ember of defiance that had carried them this far. Krios gave them a small pouch of coins, his final act of mercy. "Don't squander it," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "And don't trust anyone." He turned back to his ship, his cloak billowing as he disappeared into the crowd. Irene and Chloe stood alone, the harbor a sea of faces that offered no welcome. They were free, but freedom was a fragile thing, a flame that could be snuffed out by a single misstep. They moved through the market, their tunics ragged, their faces marked by hunger and resolve. Irene's eyes scanned the crowd, wary of slavers, of eyes that lingered too long. She thought of Thalia, of the captain, of the girl from Charistos who had dreamed under the stars. Each was a thread in her story, a reason to keep moving. She and Chloe would find work, perhaps as weavers or servants, blending into the tapestry of Crete's chaos. They would live not as slaves, but as women who had defied the gods and men who sought to break them. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sea in hues of fire, Irene whispered a vow to the wind. She would carry Thalia's sacrifice, Chloe's courage, and her own unbreakable spirit into this new world. Crete was not the end, but a beginning, a shore where their story could be rewritten, one defiant step at a time. The ember within her burned brighter, a beacon against the shadows, and she stepped forward, ready to face the fates that awaited. Chapter 6. The Weaving of Shadows. The harbor of Knossos pulsed with the lifeblood of Crete, a chaotic symphony of shouting merchants, creaking carts, and the briny tang of the sea. Beneath a sky streaked with the dying embers of dusk, Irene and Chloe stood on the edge of this new world, their ragged tunics and bruised bodies marking them as outsiders in a land that devoured the vulnerable. The pouch of coins from Krios hung heavy at Irene's waist, a lifeline as fragile as the hope that had carried them across the sea. At 17, Irene was no longer the girl from Charistos who ran laughing through olive groves. She was a storm forged in fire and pain, her spirit a blade tempered by defiance. Beside her, Chloe's eyes darted through the crowd, her scarred hands clenched, ready to fight or flee at the first sign of danger. Crete was a land of myths, where the ghosts of Minos and his labyrinth whispered in the shadows of sunlit hills. But for Irene and Chloe, it was a crucible, a place where freedom could be won or lost in a single misstep. The market stretched before them, a labyrinth of its own stalls piled with figs and pottery, voices haggling in tongues they barely understood, and eyes that lingered too long on their faces. They moved cautiously, their steps measured, their heads low to avoid notice. Slavers prowled these streets, their chains coiled like serpents, and Callista's reach was a specter that haunted every shadow. "We need work," Irene whispered, her voice steady despite the hunger gnawing at her belly. "Something to keep us hidden until we can disappear." Chloe nodded, her gaze fixed on a stall where an old woman wove baskets, her fingers deft despite her age. "Weaving," Chloe said. "It's honest, and it keeps us out of sight." Irene agreed, her mind racing. Weaving was a skill she had learned in Charistos, her mother's hands guiding hers through the warp and weft of wool. It was a thread to her past, a way to reclaim a piece of herself. They approached the old woman, whose name was Myrene, her face a map of wrinkles and wisdom. Her eyes, sharp as flint, studied them with a mix of suspicion and pity. "You're runaways," she said, her voice low, cutting through the market's din. Irene stiffened, but Myrene raised a hand. "Don't lie to me, child. I've seen your kind before eyes like yours, burning with fear and fire. Work for me, and I'll ask no questions. But cross me, and I'll sell you myself." The bargain was struck with a nod. The coins from Krios enough to secure a corner of Myrene's workshop, a cramped space filled with looms and the scent of damp wool. They slept on straw pallets, their bodies aching from days at sea, but the rhythm of weaving was a balm. Irene's fingers moved with practiced grace, threading wool through the loom, each pass a small act of creation in a world that had tried to destroy her. Chloe, less skilled but determined, learned quickly, her hands steady despite the scars that marked them. Myrene was no savior, but she was fair. She fed them bread and olives, gave them cloaks to hide their faces, and taught them the secrets of Crete's markets, where to sell their baskets, whom to avoid, how to blend into the crowd. "Knossos is a spider's web," she warned. "Step lightly or you'll be caught." Irene listened, her eyes scanning the workshop's shadows, her instincts honed by years in Callista's house. She knew the world was no kinder here than in Athens, but it was different, and that was enough to keep the ember of defiance burning. Days turned to weeks, the rhythm of the loom a heartbeat in their new life. They worked from dawn to dusk, their fingers calloused, their spirits slowly mending. But the past was a relentless hunter, and its shadow fell one evening as they returned from the market, their arms laden with baskets. A man stood in the alley outside Myrene's workshop, his cloak dyed the deep purple of wealth, his eyes cold and calculating. Irene's heart lurched. She knew that look, the predatory gaze of a slaver. "You're far from Athens," he said, his voice smooth as oil, "but not far enough." Chloe stepped forward, her body shielding Irene's. "We're no one's property," she said, her voice steady but laced with fear. The man smiled, a serpent's grin, and signaled to two figures lurking in the shadows. They were armed, their bronze blades glinting in the torchlight. Callista sends her regards, he said. She wants her toys back. Irene's hand slipped to the small knife she had begun carrying, a crude blade Merin had given her for cutting wool. It was no match for swords, but it was hers, a piece of her defiance made tangible. Run, she whispered to Chloe, her eyes never leaving the man's. But Chloe shook her head, her scarred hands clenched into fists. Not without you. The men advanced, their blades drawn, their steps confident. Irene's mind raced, her body tensing for a fight she knew they could not win. But before the first blow could fall, a shout echoed from the alley's mouth. Myrene appeared, her frail frame belied by the fire in her eyes, a staff clutched in her gnarled hands. Leave them, she barked, her voice carrying the weight of a lifetime's survival. Behind her stood a handful of market workers, potters, fishers, weavers, armed with whatever they could grab. Sticks, stones, a broken amphora. The slaver hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the odds. Myrene stepped closer, her staff raised like a scepter. Knossos protects its own, she said. These girls work for me. Touch them, and you'll answer to the market. The workers closed ranks, their makeshift weapons a silent threat. The slaver's men faltered, and with a curse he retreated, his cloak vanishing into the shadows. Irene's knees buckled, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Myrene turned to her face stern but not unkind. You've brought trouble to my door, she said, but you're no slaves here. Work hard and Knossos will shield you. Eirene nodded, her throat tight with gratitude. Myrene was no mother, but she was a guardian, a woman who had carved her own place in a world that devoured the weak. The encounter shook them, a reminder that freedom was a fragile thread, easily severed. Eirene and Chloe redoubled their efforts, weaving baskets with a fervor that bordered on desperation. They learned the rhythms of Knossos, its alleys and secrets, blending into the crowd like threads in a tapestry. But the nights were haunted by dreams of Thalia's blood, of Melina's whip, of Callista's cold smile. Eirene woke often, her heart pounding, her hand reaching for the knife she kept beneath her pallet. One evening, as they sat weaving by lamplight, Chloe spoke, her voice soft but urgent. We can't stay here forever, she said. Callista will send others. We need a plan, a place to go, a way to disappear for good. Eirene nodded, her fingers pausing on the loom. Crete was a refuge, but it was also a trap, its shores too close to Athens' grasp. She thought of the mountains, of villages where no one knew their names, where they could live as free women, not runaways. Myrene overheard, her eyes sharp in the flickering light. There's a place, she said, her voice low, a sanctuary in the hills where women like you, runaways, outcasts, find shelter. It's hidden, guarded by those who've escaped worse than you. But it's no easy path. The mountains are cruel, and the journey is watched. Irene's heart leapt, a spark of hope igniting in the ashes of her fear. A sanctuary, a place where the chains of her past could not reach. But the journey was a gamble, a path through wild lands where bandits and beasts roamed. She looked at Chloe, whose scarred hands trembled, but whose eyes burned with resolve. We'll go, Eirene said, her voice steady. We've faced worse than mountains. Myrene gave them a map, scratched on a scrap of leather, and a warning. Trust no one but each other, she said, and take this. She pressed a small bronze amulet into Irene's hand, its surface etched with the image of Artemis, goddess of the hunted. She watches over those who run. Eirene clutched the amulet, its weight a reminder of the gods she had forsaken but could not entirely abandon. They left at dawn, their cloaks heavy with the morning mist, their pouches filled with bread and a few coins. Knossos faded behind them, its clamor giving way to the silence of the hills. The path was steep, the air sharp with the scent of pine and danger. Eirene led the way, her knife at her side, her senses alert for the rustle of leaves or the snap of a twig. Chloe followed, her steps sure despite the weight of their shared past. The first night in the mountains was a trial of endurance. They camped in a shallow cave, the wind howling like a chorus of furies. Eirene kept watch, her eyes scanning the darkness, the amulet cold against her chest. She thought of Charistos, of her mother's garden, of the girl who had believed in a world where justice was more than a philosopher's dream. That girl was a ghost now, but her memory was a fire that kept Eirene alive. On the second day, danger found them. A shadow moved in the trees. A man, his cloak tattered, his eyes glinting with hunger. "Lost, are you?" he called, his voice smooth but edged with menace. Irene's hand tightened on her knife, her body tensing. Chloe stepped beside her, a rock in her hand, her face a mask of defiance. "We want no trouble," Eirene said, her voice steady. "Let us pass." The man laughed, stepping closer, his hand on a dagger at his belt. "Trouble finds those who run," he said. "Give me your coins and maybe I'll let you live." Irene's heart raced, but she held her ground, the ember of defiance flaring into a blaze. She lunged, her knife flashing, aiming for his arm. He dodged, his dagger slicing through her cloak, grazing her side. Pain flared, but she fought through it, her movements fueled by years of suppressed rage. Chloe struck, the rock crashing against the man's skull. He staggered, blood streaming down his face, and Eirene seized the moment, driving her knife into his shoulder. He fell, cursing, and the girls ran, their breasts ragged, their feet pounding against the rocky path. They did not stop until the sun was high, their bodies trembling, their wounds bleeding, but their spirits unbroken. The sanctuary was closer now, its promise a beacon in the wilderness. Eirene and Chloe pressed on, their bond a shield against the world's cruelty. They were not free, not yet, but they were alive, and each step was a defiance of the chains that had bound them. The amulet of Artemis swung at Irene's neck, a reminder that even the hunted could become hunters. As the mountains rose around them, their peaks sharp against the sky, Eirene vowed to reach the sanctuary, to weave a new story from the threads of her pain, a story of fire, of freedom, of a girl who would not be broken. Chapter 7. The Pyre of Dreams. The mountains of Crete rose like the jagged teeth of a forgotten god, their peaks piercing a sky heavy with the threat of rain. Eirene and Chloe, now battle-worn shadows of the girls they had been, pressed onward through the rugged terrain, their steps faltering but resolute. The sanctuary Marine had spoken of, a hidden haven for runaways, loomed in their minds as a beacon, a fragile promise of a life unchained. At 17, Eirene carried the weight of her past like a cloak of iron. The screams of Charistos, the fires of Athens, the blood of Thalia staining her hands. Beside her, Chloe's scarred face was set with grim determination, her eyes reflecting the same unyielding ember that burned in Irene's heart. They were not free, not yet, but they had clawed their way this far, defying gods and men who sought to break them. The path was treacherous, a winding scar through cliffs and thickets, where every rustle of leaves was a potential threat. Their bodies ached. Irene's side throbbed from the bandit's blade. Chloe's hands bled from gripping rocks to steady their climb. The amulet of Artemis, cold against Irene's chest, was their only talisman, a whisper of divine protection in a world that had forsaken them. The air grew colder as they ascended, the wind carrying the scent of pine and the distant howl of wolves. Hunger gnawed at their bones, their small stash of bread long gone, but they pressed on, driven by a shared vow, to reach the sanctuary or die trying. As dusk fell, painting the mountains in hues of blood and shadow, they found a cave to shelter for the night. Its mouth was narrow, its depths cloaked in darkness, but it offered respite from the wind's bite. Eirene built a small fire with twigs and flint, its frail light dancing on the stone walls. Chloe sat close, her knees drawn to her chest, her voice soft as she spoke of a future they could barely imagine. "When we reach the sanctuary," she whispered, "we'll learn to live again, not as slaves, but as sisters, weaving our own lives." Eirene nodded, her throat tight with the weight of hope. She wanted to believe, but the world had taught her that hope was a blade that cut both ways. The fire's glow revealed etchings on the cave walls, crude drawings of women with bows, of deer fleeing hunters, of hands clasped in defiance. Eirene traced them with her fingers, her heart stirring. "Others have been here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Others like us." The thought was a spark, a reminder that they were not alone, that their story was part of a larger tapestry woven by those who had refused to be erased. She clutched the amulet, praying to Artemis not for salvation, but for strength. But the gods, if they listened, were cruel. Dawn brought not the sanctuary, but the sound of boots on stone, the clink of chains and the low murmur of voices. Irene's blood ran cold as she peered from the cave's mouth. Below, a group of men moved through the past slavers, their cloaks marked with the sigil of Athens, their faces hard with purpose. At their head was a figure she knew too well, Melina, her arm bandaged from Irene's shard, her eyes burning with a vengeance that could set the mountains ablaze. Callista's reach had found them, a noose tightening across the sea. "We have to move," Eirene hissed, pulling Chloe to her feet. They scrambled deeper into the cave, hoping for a hidden passage. But the walls closed in, a dead end. The only way out was through the slavers. Irene's hand found her knife, its blade worn but sharp, a final defiance against the inevitable. Chloe gripped a jagged rock, her face pale but fierce. "If we die," she said, her voice steady, "we die free." The slavers entered the cave, their torches casting monstrous shadows. Melina's voice cut through the silence, sharp as a whip. "You thought you could outrun me?" she sneered, her dagger glinting in the firelight. "Callista wants you alive, but she didn't say in what condition." The men fanned out, their chains rattling like the laughter of fates. Irene's heart pounded, her mind racing for a way out. But the cave was a trap, its walls a tomb. She lunged, her knife flashing toward Melina's throat. The overseer parried, her dagger slicing Irene's arm, blood welling hot and bright. Chloe swung her rock, striking a slaver's shoulder, but another seized her, his chain wrapping around her wrist like a serpent. Eirene fought, her blade finding flesh, but there were too many. A fist struck her temple, stars exploding in her vision, and she fell, her knife clattering to the stone. Melina towered over her, her smile a crescent of cruelty. "You'll beg for death before I'm done," she said, her voice a promise of torment. They were dragged from the cave, their bodies battered, their spirits bruised but unbowed. The slavers bound them with chains, the iron biting into their skin, a cruel echo of their past. The sanctuary was so close, Eirene could almost feel its promise, a whisper of safety just beyond reach. But as they were marched down the mountain, that hope crumbled, replaced by a cold, searing rage. She looked at Chloe, whose eyes still burned with defiance, and knew they would not surrender, not even now. The slavers' camp was a grim tableau, a clearing ringed with torches where other captives huddled, their faces hollow with despair. Eirene and Chloe were thrown to the ground, their chains tethered to a stake driven deep into the earth. Melina paced before them, her whip uncoiled, her voice dripping with venom. "You burned Callista's house, humiliated her before Athens' elite," she said. "Now you'll pay, slowly, publicly, so every slave knows the cost of rebellion." The punishment began at dawn, a spectacle designed to break not just their bodies, but the spirits of all who watched. The slavers gathered, their laughter a chorus of cruelty, as Melina's whip lashed Irene's back, each strike a line of fire that tore a cry from her lips. Chloe, chained beside her, screamed defiance, her own body marked by the whip's cruel kiss. The captives watched, their eyes wide with horror, their silence a testament to the power of fear. Irene clung to the memory of Charistos, of her mother's garden, of Thalia's blood, but each lash stripped away a piece of that memory, leaving only pain. As the sun climbed, the slavers grew bored, their attention turning to other cruelties. Melina, her arm tiring, devised a final torment. "Let the gods judge them," she declared, her voice ringing with mock piety. She ordered the captives to be taken to a cliff overlooking the sea, a place where the waves roared like a chorus of the damned. Irene and Chloe were forced to the edge, their chains heavy, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and pain. The drop was sheer, the rocks below jagged teeth waiting to claim them. "You wanted freedom," Melina said, her eyes glinting with triumph. "Take it." She raised her dagger, not to strike but to sever the chains that bound them to the stake. Irene's heart lurched. She understood the cruel jest. Freedom was a fall, a choice between death on the rocks or a return to slavery. She looked at Chloe, whose face was a mirror of her own resolve. They would not go back. "Together," Irene whispered, her voice a vow. Chloe nodded, her scarred hands finding Irene's, their fingers entwining as they had in the hold of the Erythra. The slavers laughed, their voices a cacophony of scorn. But Irene heard only the sea, its call a promise of release. She thought of Thalia, of Marine, of the captain who had risked all for them. She thought of the girl from Charistos, who had dreamed under the stars and believed in a world where justice was more than a lie. They stepped forward, their chains clanking, their eyes locked on the horizon where the sea met the sky. The wind howled, carrying their defiance to the gods who had abandoned them. As they fell, the world slowed, the air a rush of salt and sorrow. Irene's mind filled with memories of her mother's laughter, of olive groves swaying in the breeze, of the cave's etchings that spoke of others who had fought and failed. She and Chloe were not the first, nor would they be the last, but their story would echo, a cry against the silence of a world that devoured its own. The rocks met them with a mercy the slavers never could, their bodies breaking against the unyielding stone, the sea claiming them as its own. The slavers watched, their laughter fading into unease as the waves roared, a requiem for the girls who had defied them. Melina turned away, her victory hollow, her whip stained with blood that would never wash clean. But the story did not end with their fall. In the markets of Knossos, whispers spread of two girls who had burned a noblewoman's house, outwitted slavers, and chosen death over chains. Myrene, weaving her baskets, told their tale to the women who came to her, her voice fierce with pride. The captives in the slavers' camp spoke their names in secret, a prayer against despair. Irene and Chloe became a legend, a fire that burned in the hearts of those who dreamed of freedom. Yet the world that killed them marched on, its marble halls and philosophical debates built on the bones of the forgotten. Callista's symposiums continued, her guests toasting to virtue while their hands dripped with cruelty. The sanctuary in the hills remained hidden, its doors closed to the girls who had almost reached it, and the gods, if they watched, remained silent, their altars stained with the blood of the innocent. The tragedy of Irene and Chloe was not their death, but the world that demanded it, a world where beauty was a curse, where defiance was a crime, where the powerful feasted on the pain of the powerless. Their fall was a scream of rage, a cry that echoed through the ages, demanding that the world look upon its own reflection and recoil. They died as they lived, unbroken, unbowed, their hands clasped in defiance, their names a wound in the heart of a civilization that called itself divine. And so, The pyre of their dreams burned on, a beacon for those who would follow, a reminder that even in death, the human spirit could rage against the darkness, unyielding, eternal, and forever free.